Hey everyone, and welcome back to the getwellbe podcast. This podcast is designed to arm you with the knowledge and awareness you need to get and stay well your whole life. Spring is in full bloom now, and May is one of my favorite months of the year. Speaking of full bloom, my guest today was inspired by a life journey I'm about to embark on, or I'm already on. Some of you may know that I'm currently 22 weeks pregnant with another boy, so just over halfway there. My first son, Austin, is just about 20 months old now, and I'm thinking a lot about how to not screw him up or his soon-to-be little brother, even though it's probably inevitable, but I'm going to try my hardest not to. My guest today, Donna Jackson Nakazawa, is an award-winning journalist and the author of several books. Her work explores a topic growing in popularity called psychoneuroimmunology, which is the intersection of neuroscience, or physical brain development, immunology, or the immune system, and human emotion. Her mission is to translate emerging science in ways that can help to foster healing. As someone who works with private clients and builds programs focused on helping people struggling to figure out and heal chronic symptoms and diseases, I wanted to dive further into how our traumas and emotions impact our immune systems and our ability to fight and heal disease. And so Donna was the perfect person to help me do this. Without further ado, here is Donna Jackson Nakazawa. Donna, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Pleasure to be here with you.
Okay, so I asked Donna to come on the show with me because I have been fascinated by the concept of neuroimmunology, which she's going to talk more about, and just really the ways in which the immune system and our brains and emotions and mental health and brain science all kind of affect one another. And she's going to tell us a lot more about that. So first of all, can you introduce the concept of neurobiology and also neuroimmunology, since it's, I think, a little bit different to the WellBe community, and how your work ended up focusing on this very specific but fascinating topic?
Really, what's of interest to me as a science writer is exploring and finding a way to take what's really happening in scientists' labs and shorten that time span between what they know and what we know, right? We're, in our lived experience, how can we more quickly assimilate what's coming out of the top labs and the top researchers around the world so that we can live healthier lives? And certainly over the past 10 to 15 years, the world of neurobiology has just expanded exponentially with an understanding of how these things are connected. Our thoughts, our stress response, our immune system kicking in for good or for ill, and how that in turn affects our physical and mental health. So the word for that, the fancy word, is psychoneuroimmunology. And if you break it down, it makes sense. Psych, our thoughts, neuro, brain activity, immunology, your immune system, what we could also think of our stress response, like how much are we like getting ready to fight our environment. And so all those things are connected. And the last decade has just been mind-blowing in terms of our understanding of how the body and the brain are talking to each other, what they're chatting about, and how that affects our health. So I'm a science journalist, as my agent and editor like to say, you like a gnarly problem. And I do like to explain gnarly problems. And I think that's probably why I do focus on neurobiology and emotion the way that I do, because if you can explain it to people in the right way, with the right stories, the right images, and with the right depth, it changes their ability to do the work, to be better able to respond to the nonstop stressors that are especially coming at us in today's world.
I really agree with that. I'm a patient advocate apart from this content side of my work, and you have such a different experience with human beings when you explain the why. Like once they get the concept of something, they'll want to do it more. than just being told to do it and not understanding why they're doing it. I think it's really empowering and important, and really the key to any sort of behavior change, I think. But as I said, not only do I do that, but at Wellbe on the content side, I've been highlighting experts like yourself, but also successful healing journeys through a more holistic approach. And I think you've had one yourself. So could you share a little bit about your autoimmune disorder and how your healing journey led you to your work, but also to the discovery of adverse childhood experiences, also known as the acronym ACEs, and this link between difficult childhood experiences and chronic illness in adulthood?
So it's weird because I've been a journalist for so long. And so it's really weird how sometimes my personal experience will dovetail with something that I'm reporting. So for instance, case and study, I wrote a book called The Autoimmune Epidemic, which some of your listeners might know. It came out maybe 15 years ago. And while I was writing that book, I knew that I already had thyroiditis, which is an autoimmune disease, and I had small fiber sensory neuropathy, which is a neurological autoimmune disease. But as I was writing it, I also developed a very rare autoimmune disease similar to MS, but a little bit different in its trajectory and recovery, called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And during that time, I was actually writing the book about autoimmune disease. And I thought, okay, I really have to double down here, because for me, that experience, even as I recovered, I then had a relapse. And while I was raising really young children, I was disappearing into the hospital for 4 or 5 weeks at a time. And anyone with autoimmune disease who knows that how unexpectedly things can flare and completely erase life as you know it, so to speak, and land you in the hospital for long periods of time. I really felt, especially writing from a feminist perspective, with the growing knowledge at that time that these diseases affected primarily women, and that there were differences in how the immune system was responding to stress, and particularly differences in how female autoimmune disease patients with autoimmune disease, how seriously they were being taken by their physicians, right? Like the gaslighting that was going on around autoimmune disease a little more than a decade ago would totally floor a listener listening today. So we still know gaslighting, medical gaslighting is like all the rage. But at that time, the average woman that I was interviewing with autoimmune disease had been written off by so many doctors that her fight to find answers and to find validation and healing in the medical community was enraging to witness as I interviewed people. And I was very lucky at that time I have a neurologist who I absolutely adore at Hopkins. We're very close. And I was getting good treatment, but even with good treatment, people around me treated me like, well, what do you mean? You were paralyzed, like, well, how did that happen? I even had one guy say to me, a very famous researcher say to me, well, nobody gets Guillain-Barré twice. That couldn't have happened. Maybe something else was going on. And of course, you talk to any neurologist and they will tell you there are patients who do have the disease a second time. So that left me really at a disadvantage raising my beautiful son and daughter. I spent 6 months in a wheelchair the second time I had Guillain-Barré, and it changed their lives dramatically. And they would witness me like just trying to get, I couldn't go up and down steps for a very long time. And even when I could again, the exhaustion level would be like, get up to sit down for half an hour, get up to sit down for half an hour. And I just didn't want that life for us or for them. My own father had died when I was 12, and I just wanted to find out everything that I could after I'd written The Autoimmune Epidemic. And I went on this year-long journey to try to figure out everything I could about psychoneuroimmunology to bring down my own stress response and kind of shift my brain out of that sympathetic nervous system, fight, flight, freeze, and into a different aspect of that autonomic nervous system, which I'm sure your audience is well aware of, out of fight, flight, freeze, back into that rest, digest, savoring sensation to be the parent and the human and live the life that I felt that was there if I could figure out a way to do it. And in that process, to answer your question, I came across the ACEs study. And it had already been out for a while, but nobody was reporting on it. And I just couldn't wrap my head around, again, how such a major trend was not known to the average person. So I reported that book, The Last Best Cure, in 2010. And it was just unheard of. Nobody knew what we were talking about when we talked about ACEs. But as your listeners know, and I'm sure you're aware, we've since discovered 2,000 more studies have been done since then, based on the original study, which came out in 1998. And 2,000 studies show that there is a dose-dependent relationship between the number of categories of adversity that you face before the age of 18 and your later mental and physical health. And that takes us back to your first question, which is, how is it that your fight, flight response, your stress response, jacks up your immune system in ways that predict disease across the lifespan?
Wow. So, okay. So now that we know, from all these studies confirming it, that there's this connection, did you have, you don't have to detail them, but did you have ACEs that you could then relate to your own autoimmune disorder, or was that
Sure.
unrelated?
Yeah. No, I think that we generally find, and we know that for women in particular, for every category of adverse childhood experiences or ACEs you experience growing up, your chance of later being hospitalized with an autoimmune disease, so that's pretty serious. You don't just have an autoimmune disease, you are hospitalized with it, rises by 20% for every category of adversity. So that work is done by Delisa Fairweather, who was at Hopkins, who's now at Mayo, and also Vincent Felitti, the original founder of the ACE research. So that relationship, when I saw this research again, I was like, okay, why aren't we talking about this? And why aren't we doing something about it? For me, yes, my father died from a medical accident when I was very young. It changed family life dramatically for all of us. So my ACEs were pretty high. But I also felt that, to go back to something we said earlier, that information was gold, right? Like, okay, if I know, and if the research shows that our stress response, like how much of a state of emergency are we in all the time? Like how much are we revving up like a background hum across our lives? That background hum that's going. If that's really determined by our experiences early in life, if that stress machinery gets activated and it kind of stays on, so that the way I explain it, it's kind of like a garden hose, right? The stress response should turn on and off like a faucet. It's on when it's appropriate, turns off when you no longer need it. But in people with ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, particularly 3 or more, that stress response in childhood gets turned on like a garden hose. And the genes that oversee how it turns on and off shift. Epigenetic shifts happen so that stress response stays geared on high, because as a child, that's what you needed. You needed to keep in that state of chronic vigilance. And over time, it shifts the genes that oversee your stress response, setting it on high across the lifespan. So it makes sense that we see more disease, more mental health issues in relationship to ACEs. My question was, how do I turn the garden hose off? What are some ways I could do that? And let me do them.
Yeah. You mentioned the number 3. I'm asking another question about that because I took it online myself. I had some ACEs growing up. 2. And I also have a mild case of Hashimoto's that I've had for as long as I can remember. And I read about this far before I ever, read about your work. And I think people can take this test
Oh,
freely
sure.
online.
Yeah.
I think it was like, maybe 15 questions, something like that?
10 questions,
10
although it's
questions.
since expanded to include many other types of childhood stressors, because the original 10 questions really talk about household dysfunction and things going on within the home. But we now have a very clear understanding that ACEs also include stressors in the community, like poverty and racism, sexism, community violence, and so on. Those are also things that create chronic unpredictable stress in a child's life, which sets that garden hose on high. But anyway, you were telling your story.
No, I'm glad to hear that because I did take it quite a long time ago. So I think it's good to know it's been updated. But yes, I remember that I had 2. And so I was like, oh, I'm right below the the limit. But certainly I can't help but think that they are, the 2 things are connected. My own health. And like you, I sort of learned enough to know that it's not a life sentence, that
No,
that there are very different ways that you can reverse or even
absolutely.
manage or bring down your body's level of autoimmunity should you have one or more autoimmune conditions, that you can have it be almost subclinical even, or completely gone, or be something that makes you completely disabled and takes over your life. So it's very different. And a lot of that work is, diet and lifestyle related, but also this work that we're going to talk about later that you've come up with that is more so around the mental emotional side of it. So before we do, I wanted to ask you, are there types of adversity that children face that you found to be most detrimental when it comes to predisposing children to autoimmune diseases specifically, but just adult disease? Because I know now that there's many in the community and in the home, but were there any found in these studies that were even more specific, or just the ones that are generally on the ACE exam?
So you would be probably surprised by this. The earliest researchers found a correlation that was slightly more significant in terms of later developing not autoimmune disease specifically, but adult physical health problems. And later came a study out of the University of Texas at Austin, which looked at, was there any type of early adversity specifically more related to the likelihood of developing mental health disorders? So physical and mental health. These studies took place 15 years apart, but they both came up with the following answer, which is that the type of childhood adversity most likely to predict that higher state of vigilance and therefore mental and physical health issues in adulthood is being chronically put down, humiliated, or criticized by your parents or caregivers.
Wow.
Right.
That's so incredible. Because I think many people, before you just said that, who didn't have a traumatic childhood by maybe the media's definition, like gunshots and death and divorce, or being physically abused or sexually abused or something like that, are thinking, okay, this is an interesting topic, but like, I'm not, it's not
Right.
something that I went through. But many people have had that kind of relationship with one or both, usually just one parent who, really puts them down in a way that's not even apparent sometimes until you leave the home to see that you were being categorically kind of put down in a way where your self-esteem is not, what it should be, and all that. So very, very interesting.
Very
Um,
interesting. Also, strong correlation with emotional neglect, feeling that your family doesn't have your back. So those two go together, right? Like if you grow
yeah,
up kind of being thrown under the bus or belittled or humiliated by a parent or told whatever, you're stupid or you'll never amount to anything, or just made fun of, in those microaggressive ways, then and emotional neglect is feeling like, okay, if I tell somebody I broke my toe, they might not take me to the doctor, or, maybe I need new clothes, but nobody really cares enough about me to do that. And then, of course, sexual abuse is also highly correlated to later mental and physical health problems. But really, the one that researchers keep coming back to is this idea of being really betrayed by a caregiver with these small moments of humiliations, ridicule, put downs. And so that really gives us attention as parents, right? Like, whoa, this is a big piece of information.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And if you think about it, sexual abuse in childhood is really, a parental role is to protect. And
Right.
so even if the abuse came from somebody that your parents didn't know or they had nothing to do with it happening, you still in a way would feel betrayed by your parents
Yes.
for not protecting you. So it comes back to the same idea, I think, of, not feeling protected by the people who are supposed to protect you at this very vulnerable point in life where you can't really protect yourself, childhood. So that is so interesting. Can you explain the science behind how traumatic events can change the architecture of a child's brain? You just mentioned the expression of genes actually changing that control stress hormone output because of these traumatic events, which then does something. So can you talk a little bit about that? I believe it has to do with
Sure. So
inflammation.
one of my books, which came out in 2020, it's called The Angel and the Assassin. And it's really
Great,
about,
great name for a book, no matter what the topic.
yeah, right. So The Angel and the Assassin was really the 2 years that I spent reporting on this very new, so new, an area in neuroscience, which it was only in 2011 that researchers discovered. And by the way, it was two kick butt female neuroscientists at Harvard, by the way, discovered that in the brain, not only do we have a functioning immune system, which is the sister to the immune system that functions in the body, that little immune cells called microglia, which researchers had largely overlooked for 100 years and thought these little microglial cells were just like these boring housekeeper cells that carted away dead neurons. And they started a series of experiments under the hunch that, well, maybe they were doing more than that. And it turns out that these little microglial cells are white blood cells that during gestation, on about the 7th or 8th day of gestation, they break off in utero, right? As an embryo is developing in utero, they break off from our white blood cells, they rise to the brain, and there are the resident immune cells in the brain that oversee, get this, how healthy your synaptic neural connections will be for life. And just like your immune system, so let's think about your immune system in your body. Your immune system is dancing with your environment 24/7, right? That's its job. It's like, are you safe? You're not safe. I've got to react to this. Oh my God, you stubbed your toe. Got to go there. Oh my God, you breathed in, something while you were gardening and spraying the roses. Got to go there and defend you from that. Obviously things like COVID, whatever it might be. You hit your finger or your thumb while you're hanging a picture. Got to go there and take care of that thumb. Well, it turns out that our body, as we said earlier, is also responding to social and emotional threats. Take the adverse childhood experiences. Your body is becoming more vigilant. Your body is going to prepare for the possibility of harm when you are emotionally stressed. Because across evolutionary time, and I'm getting a little deep in the weeds here, but I promise I'll close the loop. For us as humans, getting along together required a lot of collaboration and cooperation, right? So to be clear, I just talked about like physical harms that would make your immune system rev up. Now I'm talking about social harm that would also make your immune system rev up. The reason your immune system starts to rev up in the face of social threats is because across evolutionary time, if you were not in social harmony as part of your tribe, you would be sort of set to the outside of the tribe. You would be the last person to get the meat or the fresh tubers or the fruit. You would be the first person to get picked off by marauding tribes or predators. So would your children. there goes your gene pool, right? If you're fully ostracized, guess what? It's over. There's starvation, predators, marauding tribes. You're definitely going to be wounded at some point. So are your children. So our immune systems are so wicked smart that,
and I would imagine nobody else in the tribe then wants to mate with you. So there goes your gene pool
right.
too, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, you are. And at that very first sign, like somebody rolling their eyes, dissing you over the fire, your immune system would rev up and prepare for physical danger, because that's where that led. That is where that train was going. They had no trains back then, but that's where the train was going. Social emotional threats cause our immune system to rev up as if it is physical harm. And we have such good evidence of this in terms of measuring people's immune response through biomarkers like CRP or IL-6 or a whole host of them when stressors arise. And we could see our immune system goes, whoo, boom, I'm ready for that hit over the head. I'm ready for that, whatever, physical danger. So to our bodies, social emotional threats actually have a higher, more long-lasting expense to our immune systems than do physical threats. I know it's hard to wrap your head around. And so what you were asking me is, how is that tied to our mental health? And I talked about microglia. Now I'll tie them all together, like I promised. So when our body and our brain, which we're talking all the time, guess what? Those immune cells in your body, the white blood cells, those macrophages, which oversee them, T cells, and the microglia in your brain, they're all chatting. We thought that they didn't talk, right? We thought mind, body were somehow separate. Well, they're talking all the time, and they're talking about one thing. Are you safe or are you not safe? When that answer is not safe, whether it is physical harm or emotional threats, those microglial cells clock threat, and they can begin to morph. And I've watched them on researchers' screens in the lab. They morph from these lovely little angel dancers that run around the brain, and they pour like growth nutrient into neuronal connections, and they run around like good doctors do, going, are you okay over here? Like, how can we help this neural connection make it? They morph from those elegant dancers to become these big, like hairy Pac-Man like cells, and you can watch them do it. And they go, oh man, time to change from the angel to the assassin, got a threat coming in. And they make the same mistakes that are made in the body in response to unrelenting stress. Whereas in the body, we can see the body begin to turn on itself in autoimmune disease, right? As an overreaction to incoming stressors. In the brain, what that looks like is these elegant, beautiful microglial cells become big, fat, hairy Pac-Man-like cells, and they over-respond and they start eating up neural synapses. And later we can see this on brain scans. It looks like depression, anxiety, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease. And by the way, we're seeing this writ large when people talk about the neurobiological aspects of COVID. Guess what cell is responsible? Microglial cells. So how is it all related? It turns out it's science.
That's incredible. We'll be right back with Donna Jackson Nakazawa after this quick message. I don't know about you, but I never listen to the end of a podcast, so I'm hopping in here to let you know that the best way to stay empowered and on top of your health is to be in the WellBe community. So head to getwellbe.com/subscribe to make sure you're in like Flynn. On getwellbe.com, you'll learn about my online programs to help you go deeper and make life-altering changes to your health, and our awesome non-toxic product database, which you should definitely get access to. If you're more of a social media person, let's be friends on Instagram. Find me at getwellbe. Okay, now back to my amazing interview with Donna Jackson Nakazawa. A topic that is very, very high on the interest list of the WellBe community, and has been since I started this back in mid 2017, is gut health and the gut microbiome. And so I know from past research I've read that about 70% of our immune cells are in the lining of our gut.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about that as you were talking about our immune cells and how they're always communicating with our brains and the rest of our body. And I wondered if you could just connect those dots for me, the traumatic event with the gut and
Sure.
the immune
So
response.
if you think of our immune system as like, I don't like to use war metaphors, but it is easy for people to think of them as all these little armies like stationed in different countries. But those countries are all in a treaty and they all work together for basic harmony. You could think of, you've got like one army in the brain, one army in the gut, another army in the heart, like our heart has this huge immune response. And then another army like populated all over your body. Think of it like a board game. They're all talking, they have sentinels, they're sending like people on reconnaissance all the time from the gut to the brain. And this is why we're starting to see, and I've done a lot of reporting on how shifts in diet can kind of reboot from working with the gut, actually can help reboot and cleanse out the microglia in the brain. So it's all connected. You know that if you're listening, you know that, or you wouldn't be listening to this great podcast with Adrienne. And it's why you're here, and it's real.
Yeah, that's incredible. The vagus nerve, I believe, right, is the connection between the brain and the gut. And I feel like I can't stress to people enough, but it's still hard to understand. Most people understand the one direction, the brain sending the gut messages because they've had that nervous stomach before they give a speech, right? Or even like a distended stomach during time of great nervousness. But it's very hard to get people to understand the other direction of like these bad microbes in the gut going up and, causing bad moods and poor mental health and, an out of whack stress response. And then throw on top of that, how someone would fight disease. And they're like, whoa, it's almost too much.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
And I think a way to simplify it is just that if the country of your gut is having a problem, your brain, the cousins in your brain, that immune response in your brain will be affected. So again, these are like different countries working together for overall NATO health. Let's put it that way.
Got it. So I want to talk a little bit about your latest book because it's tied together everything that you've already told us about, but in a specific population, which is adolescent girls, called Girls on the Brink. And can you explain what motivated you to write this book? And of course, what were your findings about the neuroimmunology of this group specifically?
Sure. So obviously, I do like a gnarly problem. If you've been listening to this podcast for this long, then you know that. And I keep what I call back burner files, like things that are interesting me as I'm reading the research, reading medical journals, kind of looking at trends in neurobiology, or I'm out there like talking to neuroscientists I know and staying in touch with what's happening. And about 10 years ago, I was already starting to be very disturbed by the rising rates of depression and anxiety in girls. Then around 2019, before the pandemic, a big study came out, which flew under the radar. And it showed that 1 in 3 adolescent girls today in the United States were reporting periods of major depressive disorder. We're not talking about like upset over a breakup, but they were 6 weeks or more of a period of time of hopelessness, worthlessness, guilt, shame, and not wanting to partake in their regular activities. And it was so different from what we were seeing 10 years before. So this file really grew until after I finished my book tour for The Angel and the Assassin. I told my editor and my agent, I have to dig into this. And they were super supportive. And then, of course, the numbers just kept getting worse. And if you read newspapers, you know that the CDC came out with their biannual report just 4 weeks ago. and showed that now that number is 57% of girls reporting periods of major depression. And the CDC report is really, really mind-blowing. And the mental health arm of the CDC came out and said American girls are engulfed in trauma and worthlessness and hopelessness. So I didn't know they were working on that report while I was writing my book, but certainly it backs up what I was seeing as I went around the country and followed girls for 2 years and interviewed them and talked to the leading neurobiologists. And again, because I write from a feminist perspective, I just want to be clear about that because women have been so undermined by science and ignored by it at the same time. I did a little more digging. And now that you've heard my bailiwick as a researcher and writer, imagine my surprise when I found that all of the research that I'd been reporting on across my career was based on a male research model. So I also have a heart issue. I had a pacemaker for about 40 years, having to do with my autoimmune stuff. And all of the work done in heart disease had been done on men until the early 2000s, right? When the NIH went, women are dying in droves from heart disease, but it looks different from what it looks like in the men we studied. Go figure, we didn't study any women. Maybe we ought to do that. Everything that we talked about stress and adversity across health and development into adolescence, how it shifts genes, sets the stage for the stress response, and mental health across adulthood had been done on male research models. Okay. So that just pissed me off. And meanwhile, I am raising a son and a daughter, and I was seeing in my daughter's cohort that things were different than they were for boys of the same ages. So I spent a lot of time with, again, amazing kick butt female neuroscientists who were themselves kicking over our assumptions that the female brain would respond to unrelenting stress in the same way as the male brain. And what they found was really amazing. So to step back for a minute, we've long known that girls at puberty, for reasons unknown, have a 2 to 3 times higher rate of depression and anxiety than boys. But we haven't really known why. And part of the reason for this obviously has to do with sexism and misogyny. As girls get older, they're going into a world that's inherently more stressful because of the way that women have always been undervalued. We don't need a scientist to tell us that, right? If you're female, if you're listening right now, you can look around in your private life, you can look in your work life, and you can see plenty of examples for yourself of how you've been treated differently or maybe been more susceptible to everything from date rape to sexual harassment at work to not being paid the same wage. Every woman's experience is different, but I know if I get a group of women together at a dinner table, we all have our stories. Let's just leave it at that. So part of it's that, right? That's not rocket science, but part of it is something else that when we talk about these unrelenting stressors in children's lives, girls face more of them. They have higher scores of ACEs, probably having to do with being more vulnerable in society's eyes, growing up with being smaller and less able to, quote unquote, fight back or whatever it is, and being diminished in a misogynistic culture. But something else is going on as well. And that brings us back to the neurobiology. And that is that as estrogen comes in, it is a stress amplifier. Now, estrogen is not the problem. It's a wonderful superpower hormone. Anybody who's ever been around an adolescent girl or knows one knows that the adolescent female brain is an absolute freaking superpower. Like that spidey sense is unparalleled. That corpus callosum, which connects the left and right sides of the brain, is bigger, richer. Girls just see everything, And estrogen is also a superpower in the way that it's the reason why women can stay awake as long as a man, sometimes longer, run as fast, but do it all with smaller organs in a smaller body while making room for a uterus and carrying another life. How is it that we can do all of that estrogen is a boost in a way that testosterone is not. It's, I use the example of like Ginger Rogers doing everything that Fred Astaire did, but backwards and in high heels, right? We have this ability to do more on less and carry another life as humans. But estrogen can flip from this evolutionary advantage to an evolutionary disadvantage. So it amps up this response, immune response. It's also the reason that women have a more robust response to vaccines, right, than men do. Jacked up immune response, yay for us. But when stressors in the environment are unrelenting, when they don't stop, when we don't have a good locus of control over the stressors in our lives, whether they are physical or emotional, estrogen can flip from an evolutionary advantage to an evolutionary disadvantage. And at no time is this more true than at puberty, where it jacks up the stress response, turning that hose on that we talked about earlier, right? In a way that sets that stage for that chronic overactivation of the stress response. So when that happens, and puberty is now happening several years earlier than it used to, that surge that is coming in that is normally protective, because estrogen is so much more than sex hormone, like we associate it with that thrum of sexual excitement. It's a master regulator in the brain. It regulates the body. It regulates the organs. And at puberty, the brain, male, female, anywhere on the gender spectrum, is a detective machine. It is taking into account every stressor you have ever faced up until that moment and including at that time. And it is going to remodel the brain based on that information. And if the environment, and bring in social media and the world we've created, the kids are living in today, if that environment is sending you stress messages 24/7, whether on your phone, on your screen, in the world you live in, school competition on the sports field, whatever it is, that brain is going to remodel based on the idea that the world is inherently super, super, super stressful. You are going to grow up and go out into that world as a girl. You are going to grow up. You're going to have children maybe one day, and your body is now going to gear up for a world in which you got to fight and be prepared for really bad things. And we don't want that. We don't want that, because that brain is a brain that's also geared up for anxiety and depression. So if you want to simplify this, because that is so deep in the weeds, but there you go. If you want to simplify it, you could think of it this way, that kids are going through puberty earlier than they should. Stressors have increased, jacking up their stress machinery. For girls, estrogen comes piling in, which jacks up the stress machinery even more. The brain is getting remodeled, refired, newly wired, based on the idea that the world is inherently stressful, traumatic, and overwhelming before girls have had a chance to go through the experiences of adolescence to wire and fire up the brain in healthy ways. So this is what researchers call an evolutionary mismatch between the world we've created, especially for girls, and social media, of course, plays a role, and across evolutionary time, this idea that childhood develops, we have the kids' backs, they have this free period of time to develop, figure out how to respond to social stressors. Oh, does that friend like me or not like me? I'll figure it out. Is a problem something so stressful that it's the end of the world, or is a problem something that will get better with time? How do I ask for help? How do I even articulate the feelings that I'm having that are confusing? When puberty comes in early and the world is highly stressful, the brain hasn't wired and fired up yet for resilience, and it's being reshaped and remodeled by the wrong things at the wrong time.
So, well, that was all incredibly interesting. And something you just said made me think of a topic which is also very interesting and talked about a lot at WellBe besides gut health, and that is environmental health and toxicity in our environment. And I've had experts on and shared a lot about how plastics and these other hormone disrupting chemicals can often come into a woman's body or to any, male or female, and be what they call, xenoestrogens, or they're fake estrogens, and your body interprets it as the hormone estrogen. Meanwhile, it's not at all. It's a chemical that's in a plastic water bottle or whatever it is. And how too much estrogen can then cause, so much hormonal imbalance with these other hormones. And you're seeing so many of these diseases in young women, the PCOS, the, estrogen dominance, all of that. So when you were saying we're going through puberty before we should, I've learned that a lot of that has to do with these xenoestrogens and drinking milk from factory farm cows at a young age and just having too much hormone in your body that's unhealthy, creating a younger age for going through puberty. I believe that's kind of some of the reasons I've heard. So it's not just a normal amount. It's now, the stressors of our environment are, yes, social media and this digital world that at any moment, a horrible email, text, or direct message on Instagram could come in, or a picture of all of your friends at a birthday party that everybody's in the picture and you are not there. Instant, your whole body, your physical response, you would feel it, right? It's just like, shock. And all of that is over here, what you were talking about. But then, like, in addition, you're dealing with all these chemical toxicities creating hormonal imbalance. So it is just a perfect storm of terribleness for adolescent girls. So
let me just pile on there for a second and say that, yes, estrogen disruptors, I've reported a lot about them, but there's also something else that we haven't really taken into account that may be even more powerful in, unfortunately, a negative way, is that we have pretty good research that shifts in diet are also very, very related to early puberty. We can't leave that out. But in addition, we have good research that the higher the degree of early stress in kids' lives, the quicker the body wants to go through puberty to, again, prepare to defend, right? Like, if I grow up faster, I can defend myself better in this crazy effed up world that somehow is like coming at me hot, fast, and constantly. So,
interesting.
Yeah, it's worrisome. It's all very worrisome. But the good news is that, again, when we understand the science, it gets us very motivated to do things a little bit differently. And I think our girls deserve that.
Definitely. So that was my next question for you. What can parents, societies, schools do to support the adolescent female brain and hormone balance and the immune response during this critical development period? And inversely, what should they not do?
Sure. So I think that obviously we don't have time. My book, Girls on the Brink, has 15 like super well researched antidotes that took me 2 years to put together and write. So I'm going to try to run through some of them, but I won't be able to do all of it. It's hard.
Yes. So people who are interested in this topic should absolutely get Donna's book to go further.
Well, get the book or borrow it from a friend or get it from the library or listen to it on Audible. I'm not one to be hawking my books, but I will say that, the parent groups we have going, it can be very empowering to have a guide on your bedstand, right? Like something to dig into and go through these strategies. I see parents with them underlined and flagged, and some have like made posters for their insides of their kitchen cabinets to remind them of things in those hot kitchen moments. But anyway, so I think the way to tie it all together is that we want to remember that all of these unwanted changes happen when stress is unrelenting, and that the more psychological stressors rise in girls' lives as they have. When we talk about misogyny, it's like been dialed up all the way by social media. It's just unbelievable. It's always been there, but now it's just like, whoa, what girls tell me they see on social media, to be popular at school They have to be hot on social media to be hot in social media. They have to be like an adult sexualized female at a very early age. And then if they are, then they might not be popular or liked or have friends because they're, seen as like being too sexual. And they also have to worry about being stalked by like older, creepy men who reach out to them. So like, there's no moment, girls tell me, in their lives where they can find a footing where they feel like they can find that space and place for them where their identity can be developed with self-agency. It's always a response to what the environment around them is asking for. So if all of those stressors are rising, and heck, we've named a lot of them, we didn't even get to school shootings and climate change and this crazy political, stupid discourse and whatever you want to say about that. All those stressors are rising. We've got to bring down their stress machinery. That's the bottom line. So how can we do that? Well, the number one factor is, of course, and it goes back to the beginning of our conversation, is really strong connection and parent-child attunement. And kids who grow up with parents who can answer yes to one question are 12 times more likely to thrive. And that one question is, how well can you and your child talk about anything? Can they come to you to tell you about anything? And what would prevent a child from being able to do that? Well, we've got to look at ourselves. We've got to look at how we manage our own stress, how we manage our own trauma, how we manage our own stuff, so that in those moments, which are high stakes, high octane parenting moments, we are able to regulate ourselves in record time. It's work. I have a whole 2.5-hour online program to help parents do this. We have to develop the skills. If you love your child, you must develop the skills to manage your own stress, your own trauma, your own history, so that you can be regulated, because every single thing that is happening in your body will be mirrored in your child's body and brain. If they're going to come to you with hard things, they have to know that you are that safe, attuned, listening parent who can hear them for as long as it takes without your own emotional reactivity getting in the way. And there are really clear steps to help you do that. But it is the single most important thing that we can do. And it's not throw a flame or a blame on parents. We all grew up with our stuff. You and I have admitted here we have our own adverse childhood experiences. And we know that individuals with a history of adversity and stress have more trouble regulating as parents in family life. We just know that. And we know that when we go in and teach parents some of these skills to understand their own trauma, see the connections in family life, or what makes me really, what are those white hot moments for me? And when we get it, when we go, oh my God, this is happening. This is a white hot moment for me, but it's not about me. Here's how I regulate myself. And here's how I become that attuned parent who is absolutely cellularly safe for a child to turn to no matter what is happening. That is the relationship goal that we're looking for. And it is work. The work starts with you. You can't get around it. That's how it is. But it's the biggest gift you will ever give your child. And from there, you can move on to the other 14 antidotes.
As soon as you said the question, can they come to you with anything? I immediately started thinking about, my own parents, my husband's parents, my friends' parents, and how so much of what myself, my husband, my friends felt they could or could not go to their parents with had to do with their parents' own trauma.
Yep.
And how they were raised. And, even if they didn't love it, but they had a father who was very like, we talk like men. We don't talk about, sissy things. Then one part of their brain knew that they didn't like that and that it wasn't a great way to grow up. The other part of the brain sort of overrides it. And then they find themselves more or less having the same, like, but we're still going to be manly men with their son. And the son's like, but didn't you just tell me you hated
Uh-huh.
that about your dad? And
Uh-huh.
yet you can't help but do this with me, And so you just also realize how much of this is conditioning and what a great lift it is and a very hard lift it is
Hardly.
to undo this
But it
condition.
is doable. And I've taught this program again. I'm not hawking this, whatever you want to do with you, if it's helpful, yay. If not, there are so many helpful things out there. But I've taught this 3-hour program at universities across the country, from medical schools to behavioral health teams, from, Rutgers to Columbia to whatever. And it's just, we have the ability now to use narrative writing prompts, some drawing. I teach some drawing, because and to actually use discrete, fast exercises to help you get that trauma out and onto the page in very simple ways. Let me tell you, this is very simple. And to create a fact pattern out of it, that while learning how to have self-compassion for that and for what happened, right? Because it isn't just about what happened. It's about turning the way, flipping the way that you see it with self-compassion. And when you understand those connections, when you understand that fact pattern, it changes everything, because you can be in the moment with your family. You can be in the moment with your child and you go, there it is. There's my vortex. I got it. And I know how to view it with a self-compassion that is shifting inside of me, because I'm developing the tools to do that. And when I do that, I can flip my story to make meaning out of it and be that person for this young person who I love more than anything on the planet. And it's not as heavy a lift. Most people find it so liberating. It's like the answers of a lifetime are there and available. I feel like I'm being salesy or something. I don't mean to be sounding that way. It's just so beautiful to watch people go through this process. And it's a heavy lift, but we have ways to make the connections, connect the dots more quickly and more easily with self-compassion, with self-love, than I think people realize. And we have really great research that narrative writing programs really reduce stress and anxiety for parents. And anyway, I think it's an underutilized tool. I report on and teach a lot of different tools for bringing down our stress response. But I guess as a writer, I'm biased. What can I say? I think narrative writing is vastly underutilized, especially given that during the pandemic, the research on it really grew. And we understand that it brings down our own neurobiological, easily measurable biomarkers for stress and inflammation.
I read about your narrative writing program, and I did want to ask, how is narrative writing different from just journal writing?
Oh, sure. So narrative writing uses specific these are neuroscience-based prompts that are designed to help you get past your own resistance to answer your questions about yourself, right?
Got it. Okay.
It helps you take that leap. Like if you're sitting down to journal by yourself, where do you start? Like, what are you asking yourself? You might be really hard on yourself. You might think, well, so what? I'm writing about what dad said when I was 10 or mom did when I was 14. Well, where do I take it? Well, what does that mean? Well, how do I even begin to break it down into small, discernible, understandable bits so that I can use it for self-revelation, for self-discovery, for understanding, rewriting, not just my story, but my neural responses to stress. So we put together all of these different neuroscience-based tools to both do a deep dive in a safe way, to get the answers that are elusive, create a fact pattern around them that's emotionally felt, while creating safety in that exploration, and then being able to take that information and use it to shift how you respond in the moment right now.
Yeah, that seems an extremely good process for what you need to do. And I want to make sure, since a lot of people listen to this who may not be parents or may be thinking more about the chronic illness connection, that the narrative writing programs that you've developed that you're talking about are for both. It's not just about
it's for anyone. I have plenty of people who don't do it for parenting. It's just, we ended up talking about my latest book. So I sort of naturally connected them for that reason. But no, of course, look, we are doing this for us. And sure, if your motivation is your child, that's great. But I actually think it's better if your motivation is yourself.
Yeah, it's amazing how many people change something in their lives that would greatly increase their happiness and reduce their suffering if they would have done it years ago, but they don't do it until they're parents, and they say they're doing it for their children. And I even, became a mother in 2021. And when I got pregnant, I had been reading about different trauma release type therapies and knew I had some, mostly related to my parents, of course, as I would think almost all childhood traumas are, and decided to start doing EMDR therapy.
Great.
When I was pregnant. I did it throughout my first pregnancy. But, how long would it have taken me to do it if I hadn't gotten pregnant? Like, it was the catalyst, because I knew I had a deadline and I was like, all right, let's get these weekly sessions in, get this trauma out before, he's here. So, of course, you don't get it all out at all. But
it's a journey. It's a lifelong journey.
It's a journey.
Yeah,
definitely. Well, we have, spent more time than I thought we would together. And I am so deeply grateful for you sharing your work and for the work that you do. I think there are so many people struggling to understand the connection between why they have illness to begin with, but specifically autoimmune, because it feels like such betrayal, right? Your own body is attacking itself. Like, why would it do that? It's so wrong, and whether it leads to infertility and miscarriage or just disability, or, just suffering and these skin conditions and all kinds of things, or plenty of other illnesses, you tend to blame yourself.
Yes. You don't want that.
Right. Blame your physical body, right? Like, I wish my body would stop doing this to me. I just want to live a normal life. And in the end, the blame is so hurtful. And so when you can understand scientifically where these diseases come from and how it's not hopeless, that you can change your stress response and potentially reverse illness, or even just calm it down to make it something that's a lot easier to manage. And bonus, also feel happier and have less suffering about the things that you've experienced, is just so empowering. And I talk about WellBe's mission being to empower people all the time. It's being a patient advocate. I teach anybody I work with privately I say, by the time we're done working together, my goal is that you are your own advocate completely.
Absolutely.
And you never feel the need to have an advocate, because not only are you equipped with so much knowledge, but you have the emotional tools to advocate for yourself. So this was all really helpful, all along that mission statement. So please, anybody listening to this that wants to go further, especially on the adolescent girl topic, check out Donna's book, Girls on the Brink, or just her work. I believe your website is just Donna
Jackson Nakazawa.
Well, thank you very much again, and have a wonderful day.
Pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So that's all for today. I hope you found my conversation with Donna to be as fascinating and helpful as I did. You may not be a parent, but you definitely had a childhood. So I hope you'll take the opportunity right now, after listening to this episode, to think about how some of your childhood experiences have affected your emotions, your brain activity, and your immune system function as an adult. And if you think perhaps yours had a negative impact on your health, now you have some tools and ideas about how to improve it. I have another great and more personal episode on this topic about my experience with EMDR therapy during my first pregnancy back in 2021. So search EMDR and getwellbe in your podcast app, and you should be able to find it. To read the written version of this episode with Donna, complete with plenty of research links, head to getwellbe.com or check out the link in the show notes. And while you're on getwellbe.com, definitely become a Wellbe Insider to get our latest content delivered to you in your inbox whenever we have something new to share. And if you haven't already and found this episode helpful or interesting, subscribe to the podcast. This way you'll never miss a new episode and they'll be delivered to you whenever we publish a new one. And please share this episode with family or friends who you think might find it valuable and informative. It means a lot and helps more people find the podcast. Finally, if you love the Get Wellbe podcast, please leave me a quick review. If you already have, then thank you so much. I really appreciate it. This is your host, Adrienne Nolan-Smith, and thanks again for listening to the Get Wellbe podcast.